Imagine watching a giant fall in slow motion. A country that once dominated the entire world with its economic, military, and cultural power is reaching the end of its reign. While China quietly advances and the world is being reshaped, the United States seems to be wavering on the very foundations that once made it unstoppable. Are we witnessing the beginning of the end of the American empire, or is this just another transformation in the history of global power? What comes next could change the way you see the future of the planet. And before we continue with more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Hit the bell icon too, so you never miss the next chapter.
After decades of politicians who destroyed Detroit to build up Beijing, you finally have a champion for workers in the White House, and instead of putting China first, I'm putting Michigan first, and I'm putting America first.
Those were the words Donald Trump himself used during his campaign, promising to restore America's golden age. Yet the truth is, those words have echoed in Washington for generations. And history tells us they always come with a warning. The Dutch, once the masters of global trade, fell. The British, who ruled a quarter of the world, fell. Even the Romans, who believed their empire would last forever, fell. And now, it seems another name may be added to that list. For nearly a century, the American empire has enjoyed total dominance on the world stage. Despite having only 4% of the world's population, it accounts for 20% of global income, and this single country makes up nearly 40% of the world's military budget. But recently, this has been changing, and rapidly. By 2028, China is expected to surpass the United States as the world's largest economy, and for decades it has been positioning itself at the center of a new world order, waiting for the right moment to strike. Since 2010, they have invested over $1 trillion in developing countries around the world, building strategic alliances for the future. Meanwhile, the American-led world order has never seemed more fragile. Government debt has continued to pile up, and interest payments now make up 1/6 of the annual budget, while decades of globalization are being dismantled right before our eyes. The trust that America has built over generations is slowly eroding through tariffs, erratic policies, and a growing sense that the rules no longer apply. And yes, it has been warned that power tends to corrupt. We have already seen it throughout our history, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. This is not just about one leader. It's about what happens when an empire starts to believe in its own invincibility, long after its foundations have begun to crack. The question is not just about Trump, it's about whether America has crossed a point of no return. The internal struggle has already begun. But can the American world order survive? Or are we already witnessing the opening act of a new global empire? The answer is deeper than many think, and it begins years before today. So come on, let's find out. Even just a few decades ago, the idea that the American empire could begin to crumble in the near future would have made you the laughingstock of the room. By then, during the 1990s, the country was celebrating the collapse of the Soviet Union. The dollar, already dominant, quickly became the world's undisputed currency, and by 1995 it accounted for a staggering 71% of global foreign exchange reserves. The United States had officially become the backbone of the global financial system. And even more, capitalism and democracy, the very foundation of American society, were rapidly spreading across the planet. Even long-standing rivals, enemies of capitalism like Russia, Poland, and Vietnam, had begun to change their ways. The American empire had never looked stronger, and we can say that this was the beginning of the blindness that has led them to this point. But while the country was basking in its post-Cold War glory, on the other side of the Pacific, a seemingly insignificant nation was quietly laying the groundwork for its own economic miracle. By the 1990s, China had embarked on a path that would completely transform its economy, and in the process, reshape the world order. The Chinese economy would go on to grow by more than 9% per year, lifting millions out of poverty in the process. But far from being worried, the Washington elites at that time saw this as a great victory. Another communist power had changed course, recognizing the virtues of market systems. When China joined the World Trade Organization in 2000, Bill Clinton didn't just see a trade agreement. He saw a turning point in the country's future. By joining the WTO, China is not just agreeing to import more of our products. It is agreeing to import one of democracy's most cherished values, economic freedom. The fact that China remained a one-party authoritarian state was dismissed as a temporary anomaly in an otherwise flawless capitalist success story. After all, as the country developed, it would inevitably embrace democracy, right? In the eyes of Americans, China seemed to be proof that capitalism had won, and they welcomed it into the world order with open arms. From 1995 to 2010, Chinese exports to the United States rose from around 100 billion to over 1.5 trillion. But while Washington believed it had integrated China into its system, they overlooked something deeper. Dripping water can penetrate stone. China was not being transformed. It was quietly and patiently transforming its position in the world. Economies typically undergo a transformation during their development. In the early stages, they mainly produce agricultural goods, and most people live and work as subsistence farmers. Over time, populations move to urban areas and employment shifts toward industrial and manufacturing jobs. This is exactly what happened in China. From 1990 to 2020, China's manufacturing output grew from about 100 billion to nearly $5 trillion, an increase of more than 50 times. China had officially become the factory of the world, and American consumers were more than willing to adapt. Today, 97% of laptops and 78% of smartphones purchased in the United States are manufactured in China. And China was producing much more than just technology. 80% of all sporting goods in the United States also come from China, as well as approximately 83% of toys. Far from being independent, the United States had, in secret, become completely dependent on China. To be clear, for the American consumer, on the surface, this didn't seem like a bad thing. They had access to far more products than ever before, at lower prices. And while cheap Chinese products flowed into the country, American consumers spent more and more, filling their homes with low-cost goods while quietly digging themselves into a financial hole. At the start of the century, American consumer debt stood at $1.8 trillion, but by 2020, it had nearly tripled to over $5 trillion. More Americans than ever were living paycheck to paycheck, relying on debt to finance their lives. And it wasn't just consumers who became dependent on cheap debt. By 2024, the United States government had also accumulated a debt of $36 trillion. One out of every $6 spent by the US government went toward paying off this national debt, and there were no signs of slowing down. Today, projections estimate that by 2034, the debt will have risen to $54 trillion. On a per capita basis, this means that every American citizen would owe $150,000 just in debt. Thanks to decades of overspending, the country now finds itself on the brink of a crisis. But this is more than just a fiscal problem. It's a classic symptom of a declining empire. Hundreds of empires have risen and fallen throughout history, and all have followed a similar path. Their collapse is not a sudden event, but rather a gradual decline over decades, and it always begins with an explosion of debt. Let's take the Dutch Empire as an example. In the 17th century, it was the world's leading financial power and seemed unstoppable. But little by little, the government began to spend more and more, living beyond its means, without worrying much about the future. By the end of the 18th century, it was already beginning to fall apart. The signs were clear: an inflated government, growing inequality, and an excessive dependence on foreign imports. Today, the United States finds itself in an almost identical position. Decades of excessive spending and dependence on cheap imports have left the country with a fragile foundation, one that seems on the verge of collapse. But it's not just declining empires that tend to follow similar patterns throughout history. The rise of empires also follows a recognizable arc. It begins with a period of rapid economic growth, a manufacturing boom, rising exports, and a surge in living standards. Next comes an increasing international presence, with influence expanding through trade, diplomacy, and strategic investment. Over time, the emerging power slowly begins to replace the old order, reshaping global politics to place itself at the center. Today, China fits that description perfectly. For decades, the country has been preparing to define the new world order. Its strategy has been simple: invest now and dominate later. Unlike the United States or Europe, China is not a consumption-driven economy. In the United States, 70% of GDP is spent on consumption. In the United Kingdom, it's 65%. In China, it's only 39%. Of course, if people aren't spending their money, then they're saving it. And these savings have generated a huge cash reserve that the government and Chinese companies can channel into long-term investments, high-speed trains, green energy parks, and semiconductor factories, all funded by the country's savings. By the conclusion of the year 2023, household savings across the nation had impressively reached an unprecedented and substantial record of $19.1 trillion, which, when broken down, amounts to roughly $57,000 for each and every person. But this money isn't just being invested within China. By 2010, they had already started looking to the global stage with one goal in mind: to build a new world order. At the heart of this strategy is the Belt and Road Initiative. Since 2013, the country has spent more than $1.3 trillion financing ports, railways, and power plants in developing countries. The project now spans more than 150 countries, has even reached Europe, and covers over 75% of the world's population. They have also heavily invested in African development, a strategic move considering that by 2050, the continent is expected to account for more than 25% of the world's population. In just the last decade, they have financed 12,000 kilometers of roads and built more than 20 ports and 80 energy facilities. The United States has had a much less impressive development record, despite having recently been cut back. USAID, the equivalent organization, has built only 800 kilometers of roads in the last 30 years, 15 times less than China. Instead of building infrastructure, the United States' international policy seems to have a different focus, waging endless foreign wars. Since the turn of the century, the United States has participated in more than 72 conflicts abroad. Let's take just one of these examples: the invasion of Iraq. It cost an estimated $2.2 trillion. But after nearly a decade of fighting, there was nothing to show for it. For decades, it has acted as the world's police, trying to expand democracy and capitalism across the globe, often by force. China, however, has a fundamentally different approach. It is not interested in reshaping foreign governments or imposing its political system. Instead, they operate with a single goal: to increase their own influence. And surprisingly, that doesn't mean more conflicts. It often means the opposite. Instead of control, China seeks cooperation. It builds alliances with all kinds of nations, regardless of their ideology, values, or system of government. While the United States tries to remake countries in its own image, China is happy to work with them as they are. And now we are witnessing a clash between these two opposing worldviews. And it seems that China is winning. In 2023, China's approval rating in Africa surpassed that of the United States for the first time in history. And little by little, the US international presence is crumbling, struggling to keep up with the efficiency of the Chinese machine. But here's the thing: the shift in power isn't just happening abroad. For decades, there has been a silent economic phenomenon that has been slowly killing the US economy: deindustrialization. At the beginning of the 1960s, manufacturing jobs made up about 30% of all employment in the United States. By 2020, that figure had dropped to just 8%. As global trade barriers began to fall, American companies were no longer confined to domestic production. Instead, they started looking overseas in pursuit of lower costs and higher profit margins. At first, the change was slow. Textile factories in the southern United States quietly shut their doors as production moved to cheaper labor markets in Asia. Steel cities like Pittsburgh and Youngstown, which once housed hundreds of factories, began to quietly shut down. But once the floodgates opened, there was no way to stop it. What began as a trickle of closures soon turned into a mass exodus. The industrial base of the United States, the very engine of its post-war prosperity, began to disappear. The sector that once provided stable, well-paying jobs to millions of Americans was hollowed out, leaving the country completely dependent on China. And the problems don't end there. The manufacturing sector had once been the great equalizer, offering decent wages, job security, and a path to upward mobility for ordinary Americans. Without it, many were left behind in a rapidly changing economy that rewarded capital, technology, and finance, not manual labor or traditional skills. Now you might be thinking, does any of this really matter? After all, since the early 1980s, the United States economy has impressively more than doubled in its overall size, proudly boasting the most rapid and significant growth rate among all developed nations across the globe. Surely, all that substantial economic expansion and remarkable growth more than adequately makes up for the significant loss of traditional industry. But here's the problem. The economic growth figures don't take into account who is actually getting that extra money. It's all well and good to say that the average person, on paper, is wealthier than 40 years ago. But that doesn't mean that most people's lives are actually getting better. If all the increase in income ends up going to the richest people in society, the quality of life for most people won't change at all, no matter what the economic growth statistics say. And in the United States, that's exactly what has happened. Since the 1970s, the share of income received by those with middle and low incomes has decreased, while those at the top have continued to amass more and more of the country's wealth. Ethics for many has been radically different. As the richest take more and more of the gains, the middle and lower classes have seen total stagnation. The American dream? The idea that anyone could achieve success through hard work and determination now seems like a distant reality for many. To make matters worse, in the last 40 years there has been a complete explosion in housing prices. In the 1980s, the average price of a house was about $60,000. Today, those same houses would cost over $400,000, an increase of more than 500%. At a time when the real incomes of the poorest have remained completely stagnant. Stagnant wages and rising prices have left the American public disillusioned with the system. And across the country, there is a sense that their institutions are slipping out of their hands, and the demand for change is growing stronger and stronger. In 2024, a breaking point was reached. Trump won a landslide victory with the promise to do exactly what the American people had been asking for, to return America to its golden age. And his plan basically came down to a single word: tariffs. The idea was simple. By imposing a tax on imports, American companies would be forced to rethink their supply chains. To avoid the tax, companies would be encouraged to relocate production to the United States, bringing the dying manufacturing sector back to life. And as a nice additional bonus, they expected to raise $1.8 billion over a decade, money the government desperately needed given its level of debt. In a sense, tariffs seemed like a smart idea. But as you know, things haven't exactly gone as planned. Just 10 days after the announcement, Trump's team was forced to backtrack, eliminating most of the tariffs. So what went wrong? Well, the entire global economic order of the last 100 years has been built on systems of free trade and globalization, with the United States positioned right at the heart of this system. When the United States, the very architect of global free trade, suddenly made a U-turn and imposed widespread tariffs, investors were understandably alarmed, and suddenly one sector threatened to jeopardize their entire plan: the bond market. If investors lost confidence and started selling treasury bonds en masse, interest rates would skyrocket. And remember, the government owes $33 trillion. A 1% increase in interest rates costs them more than $300 billion a year. A significant increase in interest rates would turn the government's unsustainable deficits into a full-blown fiscal crisis. But this wasn't just a failed policy. It was the kind of impulsive, short-term move that has historically marked the turning point for declining empires. From Rome to Great Britain, great powers have often reacted with bold and impulsive decisions when their dominance begins to waver, clinging to control through tariffs, taxes, and isolation. The sudden withdrawal of the United States from the very global system it built was not a strategy, it was a warning sign. So, where does this leave the American world order? For decades it has reigned supreme on the global stage, and its dominance seemed unshakable. But now cracks are appearing, and rising debt and inequality are beginning to erode the foundations of American power. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Pacific, China has been playing the long game. While the United States borrowed to consume, China saved to invest, building the infrastructure and industries of the future. The contrast is clear: one nation burdened by debt and short-term thinking versus another focused on long-term growth and stability. As the United States grapples with its fiscal challenges, the world watches, wondering if the era of American dominance is coming to an end. And it is increasingly likely that the Chinese century is not only possible, but inevitable. Now keep exploring with us the unexpected twists of politics and economics. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. See you soon.